Good afternoon. I think we should start in a minute or two. If colleagues can take their seats, please. Good afternoon. I think we should make a start. I know that some colleagues are getting their caffeine after long sessions earlier today. My name is Tejendra Ferali. I'm Professor of Education, Conflict and Peace at the Institute of Education in University College London. I'm the chair of British Association for International and Comparative Education, which gives me the privilege to chair the BAICE presidential address at OCFIT. BAICE is proud to co-host the OCFIT conference on education for social and environmental justice, diversity, sustainability, responsibility. On behalf of BAICE, I would like to thank the conference co-chairs, the sub-theme leaders, for putting such a brilliant program together. Also, I would like to particularly thank Dr. Alison Buckler, who represents BAICE in the conference organizing committee. BAICE and OCFIT have a long tradition of collaboration, supporting each other and working together to promote the field of international education and development. Many of you who I have met in the BAICE conference, but there are also new faces who come to OCFIT. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about BAICE. As the chair, it's my responsibility, and I can exploit the position of chair to promote my association and your association. BAICE was founded 26 years ago and remains committed to promoting teaching, research, policy and development in all aspects of international and comparative education. We are also proud to produce our journal Compare, sounds familiar? Which is committed to advancing inclusive, rigorous scholarship in the field. Over the last year, the journal has continued to support writers from underrepresented parts of the world through the Compare Writers Workshops, Compare Fellow Program, and some of the fellows are attending the OCFIT today, and Compare Writing Champion Grants. Through a range of research funding opportunities, conference bursaries, and events aimed at research students, early career scholars, and others, BAICE has been advancing quality research, building capacity, and fostering engagement between diverse stakeholders, In 2022-2023, BAICE's support to international and comparative activities amounted to approximately £30,000. So there are wonderful opportunities for colleagues to apply for small grants to do some exciting activities with the support of BAICE. No wonder I feel so proud to be the chair of BAICE. Can I remind colleagues that BAICE is holding the AGM in lecture room 6 at New College at 5:30 today. So all BAICE members are warmly invited to attend the AGM, hear the reports and join the discussions. If you are not a BAICE member, you are very welcome to attend too, as this is an excellent opportunity to find out more about our association. You do not have to live in the UK to become a BAICE member. I know that many of you here are BAICE members who live in different institutions across the world. As we are meeting at OCFIT this year, next year will be the BAICE conference. You must have seen the most beautiful leaflet in your conference bag, which looks like this, but the mini version. So at University of Sussex, from 10 to 12 September next year, will be the BAICE conference. So we do it alternately, OCFIT conference one year and the other year BAICE conference. So the theme of the conference, as you may have seen, you must have seen, transgression and transformation, rebordering education in times of crisis, and will be co-chaired by Professors Joe Westbrook and Linda Morris. Where are the colleagues? Wonderful. Thank you. I believe the focus of this year's OCFIT conference on social and environmental justice has already sparked some great ideas and helped our thinking to mainstream the most pressing issues in education, in research and practice. We live at times when the humanity has faced the detrimental impact of climate crisis and biodiversity breakdown, and communities in low-income contexts are disproportionately affected by extreme weather events, food insecurity, water scarcity, economic disruptions, violent conflicts, and mass displacements. In such a context, global educational debates require critical reflections, reimagining the relations between global north and south to disrupt hegemonic epistemologies, to foreground the processes of resistance, knowledge production, and indigenous perspectives from the most marginalized communities globally. Dr. Bandana Shiva and Dr. Maria Ballarin, who is also here, very eloquently highlighted the urgency to imagine educational processes to tackle the problems of climate crisis and growing global inequalities. And there have been a number of panels and symposia at this conference that have spoken to this urgent issue that we are grappling with. I hope that the learning from this conference, we will engage more actively in educational research and practice that better serve the well-being of peoples at the margins as well as the planet that we share. Now, I am delighted to introduce my friend, my colleague, a wonderful person, Professor Nidhi Singhal, who will deliver the BAICE presidential address today. Nidhi is a professor of disability and inclusive education at Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge, and currently serves as the vice president of Hughes Hall College. Nidhi is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, visiting professor at University of Gothenburg in Sweden, trustee of OCFIT, non-executive director, Cambridge University Press and Assessment Syndicate, and a trustee of Cambridge Commonwealth European and International Trust. Nidhi has previously served as a BAICE vice chair and chair, and has been a great inspiration to many of us with her scholarship and activism to challenge educational inequity among marginalized groups in low-income contexts. She's worked extensively with children and young people with disabilities in South Asia and Africa, Her research has focused on the experiences of children with disabilities attending a range of different educational arrangements, the quality of teaching and learning in these settings, and the impact of schooling on short and long-term outcomes. Her major contribution in the field of CIE has been the development of culturally sensitive approaches in educational research. She is particularly interested in examining critical power relations in North-South research partnerships, the ethics of research dissemination, and I think it's very important as we are talking about big conferences taking place in the global north, and the debates continue to inspire sort of young scholars, as we've seen in many panels across in this conference, and also the impact of educational research on policy making for children with disabilities. Nidhi has extensive experience of working with key international agencies such as World Bank, UNESCO IIEP, and UNESCO, alongside disability-specific international non-government organizations such as Humanity and Inclusion and Light for the World, assisting them in developing research projects, program evaluation, and policy work. Alongside her remarkable academic achievements and contributions to the field of inclusive education, Nidhi is a deeply compassionate mentor who is committed to supporting colleagues and doctoral students in their academic and professional development. It has been a real privilege to work with Nidhi at BAICE. Nidhi will be presenting her talk on reimagining inclusive education, multiplicities of seeing, doing, and being. And we're really looking forward to this very exciting talk. Just to let you know, colleagues, that this talk is being live streamed via YouTube. This is our attempt from BAICE to sort of enhance access of knowledge to the wider public without having to register for expensive, sometimes, conferences. So her talk only is being live streamed, and it will be available as a video for everyone to watch and listen to. So I guess Nidhi will be talking about 50 minutes around that. We will see. And we will have an opportunity to engage in dialogue with her. So the floor is yours, Nidhi.
Many thanks, Tejendra. I feel truly humbled. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be delivering this keynote as the president of the British Association for International and Comparative Education. Tejendra very eloquently laid out my history with BAICE, but my own relationship with the association started during my student years. And I would like to take this opportunity to actually thank the current BAICE exec, everyone, but especially Tejendra as chair, Alison Butler as vice chair, and Ricardo Sabates as the treasurer of the association, for all they've done over the last few years, especially to reshape the present and the future of the association. To me, BAICE stands for diversity in scholarship, membership, and ideas. And I particularly celebrate its commitment to early career researchers. And I hope the spirit of this will be reflected in my keynote. This is the title, Reimagining Inclusive Education, Multiplicities of Seeing, Doing, and Being, and hopefully things will unravel as we go along. I begin by reflecting on the intellectual, political, and institutional contexts which have informed my own research and the production of new understandings through working alongside researchers from different parts of the world over a number of years. I firmly believe that knowledge creation is a collective enterprise and not the glory of a single individual. Hence, my presentation today weaves in reflective pauses where members of our research group, the Cambridge Network for Disability and Education Research, provide insights drawing on our collective work. It is also an invitation to help disrupt the notion of an expert who speaks on behalf of whom. Together, as a group, we are trying to make sense of where we started, what we have found so far in our work on disability and inclusive education, and indeed, where are we heading? I start by reflecting on my own journey in higher education, which, on reflection, I map out in 3 different phases. And huge thanks to a research member of our group, Nikita Jha, for putting together this beautiful illustration, her take on my research journey. So my journey in the field of education and international development started rather inadvertently. In the late 1990s, the Salamanca Statement had recently been signed by over 90 countries, and fervent global efforts were being directed towards the promotion of inclusive education. Working as a psychologist in a mainstream school in a special unit in Delhi, in India, I was made aware of a toolkit developed by experts in England to train everyone on how to do inclusion. I too wanted to learn these answers, and hence decided to pursue the MPhil titled International Perspectives on Special and Inclusive Education at the University of Cambridge, where I currently still am. 2 months into the program, it became clear that the international literature we were being taught was in fact literature predominantly from the UK, US, and on good days, Australia. When questioned about the relevance, the very well-meaning teaching team asked us to make presentations based on our home countries. Ironically, none of us were from the US, UK, or Australia, which made these presentations very rich. However, after we had done our presentations in the class, we went back to learning the right way of doing inclusive education. The program had very successfully othered us in many ways. Our knowledges, what we shared in these presentations, remained peripheral to what we were required to learn, the legitimized curriculum around inclusive education. My doctoral work, which was focused on understanding inclusive education in Indian schools, was, on reflection, similarly shaped through a dominant northern lens. I continued to frame what I saw in India to what Stuart Hall terms as a standard model of comparison to the West. Soon after completing my PhD, I was working with an international non-governmental organization in rural parts of Maharashtra in India. The INGO I was working with was very driven by the notion of inclusive education, loosely interpreted as all children with disabilities must study in mainstream schools. The INGO workers were getting frustrated that some parents, despite all their awareness-raising programs, were not willing to remove their children with disabilities from the special schools and move them to the mainstream school. They attributed this to stigma, reluctance on part of the parents because of their own lack of education, poverty, neglect of the child, etc. And of course, I totally agreed with all these reasons, as they were commonly mentioned in the literature I had read. One evening, on the end of a long day, I was sitting with the father of a 9-year-old blind girl, someone I had become friends with. I was expressing my frustration to this young man about how people in the community did not understand simple issues of stigma and continued to send their child with disabilities to a special school. This young father quietly turned to me and in Marathi said, which I translate here, "Sister, stigma is a middle-class luxury. I'm a poor man. I know that if my girl does not go to the blind school, she will not learn Braille. She will not learn how to take care of her personal hygiene. She will not have any friends. She will not have access to medical care. The mainstream school you keep talking about does not teach any of these simple things. I'm not worried about stigma. I'm concerned about giving my child the best to prepare her for her life. This conversation stayed with me. It was a chance to pause and reflect on the assumptions I was making. To begin to ask the question, who constructs knowledge? Or am I simply imposing what I had learned to accept as valid knowledge? I became angry. I became angry at the false promises I had been sold and my own inability to recognize these. After nearly 2 decades of navigating the wide gaze, both at an institutional level and in the wider field of scholarship I draw on, that I've truly begun to believe Bell Hook's assertion that rich, meaningful, diverse, interesting lives are lived in the margins. Recently, I reread Elaine Ulterhalter's own reflection on her internal and external foreignness, the evolving and co-constructed nature of our identities, and the implications for the methods we use in the field. What struck me on reading her article is how biographies of researchers have helped progress the discipline, even though at times it has been considered a luxury or even a distraction from the more important and serious work in policy and practice. My personal recognition and deeper appreciation of my own foreignness, how my personal history and current circumstances shape me, has been liberating. But it has also required courage, trust, and the capacity to face and find the words to express my own vulnerabilities. Today, I draw on the scholarship of the slowly growing number of scholars who are questioning the ways in which knowledge about education in Southern contexts is produced, especially in the light of coloniality and its ever-present shadow. My central argument in this talk is that the field of education and international development continues to operate largely within the frame of a white, middle-class, able-bodied child and adult. I specifically explored this by tracing how difference and exclusion, when viewed through a disability lens, remains othered, resulting in continued reproduction of inequalities in our policies and in our practices. Even though disability is a development issue, it has remained at the margins. And what I do in this talk is propose a reframing of this discourse. I argue that we need to challenge the continued perpetuation of oppressive structures and homogenized discourses within the wider field of education and international development. In line with the theme and spirit of this conference, I rethink some of the conceptualizations and ways of doing work in this area, and finally conclude by reversing the gaze to examine critically the role that research itself plays in perpetuating some of these continued hierarchies. Here, I depart a little to just elucidate my approach to disability and inclusive education. The WHO states that disability results from the interaction between individuals with a health condition, such as cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and depression, with personal and environmental factors, including negative attitudes, inaccessible transportation and public buildings, and limited social support. A person's environment has a huge impact and effect on the experience and extent of disability. While supporting this conceptualization, it is noteworthy that in practice, and all too often, disability is defined as a unitary category, without any connections being made to how the disability experience interfaces with other social relations, hierarchies, and structures, such as gender, location, ethnicity, migration, sexuality, religion, and poverty. And these intersectionalities are key. Turning to inclusive education, which has gathered significant international currency, As Abdul Rahman and colleagues recently point out, the business of inclusive education is booming. The GEM 2020 report captures the real essence of inclusive education by defining it as a process, actions and practices that embrace diversity and build a sense of belonging, rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential and should be respected. I totally accept that some critics argue that a disability focus within inclusive education is narrow. However, I adopt a very different approach. In focusing on disability, I wish to forefront that disability as a concept does not represent a homogeneous group, not least because of its socially situated nature. Additionally, there needs to be an increased recognition in the field of inclusive education that specific focus on some groups is necessary to address existing and often deep-seated structural and attitudinal barriers. This pluralization of rights approach is also reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals. While I take a predominantly disability lens, I believe that doing so illuminates a terrain of endless struggles of many other marginalized groups, and hence, I hope, has a much broader resonance with you in the audience. Internationally, the UNICEF 2021 report makes a rather somber reading. The data analyzed in this report shows some of the following key facts. A lower percentage of children with disabilities attend early childhood education than their peers without disabilities. And this disparity is more pronounced for girls with disabilities. Children with disabilities of almost every background have lower rates of primary school readiness than children without disabilities. Disparities are largest amongst children in the poorest households. Out-of-school rates increase during secondary school and are higher among children with multiple disabilities, and again are more pronounced for girls with disabilities. These glaring statistics reveal the social interconnectedness of disability with gender and poverty, and the continued inequalities that children with disabilities experience globally, despite the many significant calls for inclusive education. What is also striking from research we have undertaken across different countries is the increasing demand for high-quality education amongst persons with disabilities themselves and their families. This, I feel, is really important to underscore, as all too often, they are the ones who are positioned as major barriers to change. Findings emerging from a recent evaluation we completed for the Girls Education Challenge Fund, we noted how girls with disabilities associated schooling as important in achieving their aspirations. Using a range of participatory approaches such as collage making, photo elicitation, etc., which actually Larry will talk about tomorrow in one of the sessions, we use these approaches with different girls with disabilities across Nepal, Uganda, and Malawi, and our data showed the crucial role of education in overcoming barriers faced by women with disabilities. In our various interactions, a young girl living in Uganda stated, and I quote her here, "If a girl with disabilities is educated, she's focused on her future. I mean, she'll make her own choices. No one will force her to make choices." Unquote. Notably, these young women who were attending different educational arrangements run by the implementation partners expressed high aspirations for their future. Another girl from Malawi noted, and I quote her here, "I can say education is good. When you sit at home, you don't learn anything. You will not understand, and it'll be hard for you to get a job. But when you learn, you get a job, and you'll be rich. In my future, I want to be a doctor, and if I don't study well, I will not get that degree. These young women with disabilities associated education with becoming successful. And what was really powerful, that their notions of success encompassed not just financial independence, but also included, rather crucially, the cultivation of personal characteristics such as kindness and loving human connections. Similar patterns of education being central to employment, resulting in perceptions of increased respect, have been noted amongst young men with disabilities in an earlier project we undertook across India, Kenya, Ghana, and Pakistan. Parents of children with disabilities also commonly link the benefits of education to future employment and as a way of countering stigma. And it's also a reflection of the changing sociocultural norms in many of these countries. In our work in India, we've commonly heard parents talk about the need to educate their child with disabilities is because when we are not here, who will take care of the child? The sibling will not, because our social structures have changed and there are no social services in place. So the faith in education is huge. But what is really powerful is that parents do not construct schools simply as places for learning for their child with disabilities. This was rather stark during parental interviews we did across Malawi, Nepal, and Qatar during COVID-19. We asked parents what was the impact of the school closures. And what they noted is how school closures had not simply resulted in loss of learning, but in a significant loss of friendships, routine, support services such as access to speech and language therapy, physiotherapy, and basic food. Post-pandemic debates in our field have now begun to stress that education cannot simply be about recovering learning loss. Rather, what is needed is a focus on the whole child, including the social and emotional domains. In my experience, parents of children with disabilities have long been advocating for such thinking. Education has to be more than just learning. Thus, the question I would like to pose is, how does one address this continued social injustice wherein a significant number of children with disabilities remain excluded from education? And how can the field of inclusive education move outside its own history in the global north? The answers, I believe, lie not in a proliferation of new educational reform agendas, rather a critical re-articulation of the challenges so that they can be addressed in ways that are suitable and suited to the realities of the Southern context. And here I would like to focus on two aspects: the politics of othering and the false universalism of sameness and applicability. The concept of othering is, of course, not new. As humans, we construct categories, but the danger is we soon forget that these are socially constructed rather than natural. Edward Said powerfully noted that othering is the invention of difference, and us versus them, to separate a dominant culture or group from a supposedly inferior other. The other, in this case, are persons with disabilities, who ever so often are seen as inferior or abnormal, the subject of neglect, or are indeed recipient of benevolent charity. This othering is reflected, I would argue, both in actions of the state at the policy level and at the macro level in practices of teachers. Over the last 15 years, through various projects, we have been collecting classroom-level data in many different states in India. In the last 6 to 7 years, we have seen that teachers have become more accepting of the presence of children with disabilities in mainstream classrooms. They commonly link the benefits of schooling to employment in later life and hence hold it in high value. However, what we have consistently found is that teachers' views of children with disabilities are overwhelmingly couched in the language of deficit. They continue to be described as lacking something, low IQ, come from a poor home environment. Thus, teachers are quick to essentialize differences and commonly attribute these to within-child factors. Consequently, they hold low expectations of these children. Thus, what we have time and again noted is a realignment of the kind of learning outcomes that are expected of children with disabilities. Rather, teachers tend to prioritize social inclusion. Teachers seem to support the mantra of learning to live together rather than being together to learn. Child deficit thinking led teachers to teach less rather than more. At the state level, there's an equivalent conundrum. Equity concerns around disability are now usually mentioned in policy documents. Yet, they do not necessarily show up in operationalization of these policies at the ground level. Rather, what is painfully evident are platitudes, which are akin to what we call symbolic inclusion. Here, I would like to invite one of our research group members, Basirat, to read her self-composed poem titled, I Ain't No Afterthought. And this poem emerged after an interaction with a highly committed politician working on significant educational reforms. We were in the audience when we asked this individual why children with disabilities were not part of the reform efforts. The individual responded, we will come to them. Basirat's poem encapsulates the perspectives of a child with disability.
Born of a woman, but not like every other. I am one of those often described as the lesser. Sometimes I'm also called disadvantaged. Though I have potentials, they are encaged. I face so many walls, so hard to scale. My education, it's all but a haze. Left on the sidelines, considered an afterthought. My spirit sinks, seeing how my battles are being fought. If only they can embrace my unique light and provide opportunities for me to take flight. They say they hear my voice and understand my plight. They say they made laws that entrench my rights. But all I hear is words, words, and more words about how every child has the same rights. But of what rights we speak, I really don't know, because rights as a word is just a homophone, one that my brain finds rather confusing. With too many meanings, I find it amusing. But if you mean the one that says all children are equal, then from where I stand, I say I beg to differ. Because even though you say that all children are equal, it appears what you mean is some are more equal. And even when you choose to take some action, for your convenience, you have to do some children first before the... Oh yes, before the others, the very group that represent the lesser not by choice, but by societal standards. Yet we have no choice with your patient's demands. Even if I understand that resources are scarce, isn't it disheartening to always be left for last? I ain't no afterthought. I'm a child like every other, with dreams in my heart, with hope to discover. So before you ask me to wait, ask yourself, what is at stake? Am I giving every child a fair chance or perpetuating the circumstance? I ask you all to widen your views and see the value in embracing us too. For when you prioritize those deemed the lesser, you uplift not one child, but all children together. Let's challenge the notion of limited resources and seek creative solutions that unlock better causes. Because until you choose what must be done over what you find convenient and place collective well-being over self-interest achievement, you cannot say you have my interest at heart, or that every child is equal without playing your part. I ain't no afterthought, and I demand for better. Thank you.
This othering is also evident in relation to adults with disabilities. Efforts towards inclusive education have remained narrowly focused on children without actually much attention to adults in educational spaces because of lack of systemic and joined-up thinking. This lack of diversity within the education workforce, particularly from a disability perspective, is an international issue. Over the last 3 years, in Candor, we have been working with teachers with disabilities across India, Nepal, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and South Africa. The common theme that emerges in this work point to the fact that while teachers with disabilities are regarded as mentors and allies for students with disabilities, and even perceived as strong role models within the education sector, they face significant barriers starting from lack of accommodations during teacher training, inaccessible physical infrastructure in schools, and even limited career progression and opportunities. Rather, frightfully, based on such experiences, these teachers with disabilities were themselves not the strongest advocates for inclusion. As a teacher working in an Ethiopian school stated, inclusion is a good idea, but with very poor implementation. A lot of talk, but little action. This takes me to my second challenge: the false universalism of sameness and applicability in the field of inclusive education, particularly in relation to its implementation. Here, I draw on the idea of universal narrative of sameness discussed by Mohanty. Within the dominant discourse in the field of education and international development, there's a tendency to represent persons with disabilities living in the global south as invariably oppressed, hidden, or neglected. This rather homogenized view, as Anita Ghai at the Ambedkar University in India has reminded us, not only frames individuals with disabilities in what she calls a pity discourse, but additionally positions countries of the global south as in being in need of a civilizing agenda. I argue the danger with homogeneous representations is two-pronged. The first, there's very little desire to construct a better understanding by listening to lived realities. There's an assumption it's the same everywhere. Secondly, it also results in a stifling of innovation, given there is lack of incentive to construct more innovative and contextually grounded approaches for change. Here I'm going to invite two additional members of the research group, Kamila and Nareb, to bring to light some of the aspects of what I'm discussing through a small hypothetical enactment drawing on examples that many international donor agencies and implementing partners may have experienced. Kamala, would you like to raise your hand? Takes on the role of the donor. You can come in the front. And Larry enacts the implementing partner. Over to you.
Welcome, Madam Donor. We're so pleased to have you with us, and we're looking forward to working on inclusive education in our country. In this meeting, we would like to know more about your expectations from the project.
Thank you. Very happy to be collaborating with you. The aim of our project is to expand educational inclusion of children with disabilities in your country. This is part of our funding target for 2025. From the data about your country, we know that children with disabilities are stigmatized and marginalized. Parents don't let their children study and tend to hide them due to prejudice and lack of education. This is why we want to invest first in community and parent awareness programs.
Thank you so much for your interest. We actually did speak to the community we work in, and a lot of issues did come up, which included parents. There were transportation issues, and parents were wary of sending, for instance, their girls to school as they were mindful of their safety. In addition to this, there aren't enough schools to cater to the needs of children with disabilities, and very importantly, teachers are overworked and they need inclusive education training.
Of course, we would like to support the community, and good thing you mentioned the teachers, because we want to help teachers. We plan to do this by transforming classrooms and with television sets and laptops, and because we think EdTech is the way of the future.
But the teachers would require training in using the laptops in their practice.
I understand, but we're coming to the end of our financial year, so at present we can buy televisions and laptops for the classrooms. We believe we should not waste this opportunity of supplying technology to the communities.
Sure, ma'am, but we have severe power shortages in our country, which would make using the technology in the classrooms really difficult.
Yes, we see that, but nonetheless, the campaigns and solutions we are suggesting have been tested in some other countries like yours, and they've worked brilliantly. So we do think that they would be great for you. I mean, we would love to do the trainings and other things you mentioned, but that doesn't quite fit into the scope we want to cover, as our budget is limited, and how do I put this? It's specifically targeted, so we'll have to keep that for another time.
In a recent project funded by the Inclusive Education Initiative at the World Bank, we tried to understand decision-making processes in relation to why organizations, various international agencies, working in disability inclusive education, adopt certain implementation strategies over others. So we really wanted to get to the bottom of how are these decisions being made, because one of the things argued in the field is that there is lack of evidence, lack of systematic evidence. So what we did is we did a documentary analysis of various literature in the field in relation to what it is telling us about good practices in inclusive education. We looked at reports of different INGOs, etc., in relation to their annual reports. We also conducted a survey of different INGO stakeholder groups and interviews with the selected. What we concluded was that most organizations adopt a scattergun approach as they try and do many things on their own without seeking depth or collaborating with mainstream education structures. In their own struggles, which were very real, they tried to maintain relevance and provide support within local systems, which results often in compromise on innovation because they're trying to support the local system. What is really interesting is that majority of these organizations that we engaged with had worked for decades in the area of inclusive education with a specific focus on children with disabilities. And they were very humbly mindful of the fact that while their efforts in local communities across many countries in the globe had increased access to schools for children with disabilities, inclusive participation, and increased learning outcomes remained very elusive. This raises important ethical questions of what are we including children into? How committed are we to bringing about systemic change in existing systems? In the final section of my presentation, I wish to take a bird's eye view and propose a conceptual framing, bringing together our learnings from different projects. This simple framing of the 3 R's, rights, resources, and research, allows for the emergence of culturally and contextually situated models. It's a simple framework, but it allows us to engage in different ways and bring our own narratives to it. And it is definitely work in progress. All the 3 R's we see are interconnected, even though we as individuals might operate more in one space over the other at any one point in time, or indeed inhabit a multitude of spaces at the same time. Huge number of colleagues are very active in research, but also influence policy, vice versa. However, conferences such as this one, with significantly diverse stakeholder groups, also eliminates the need for a greater interconnectedness of these elements. So I think this is a great place to try out this model. The first R is about rights. What we propose, and is accepted and argued in the field, every child has a right to access school. But every child also has a right to participate in a range of teaching and learning processes, and to benefit from school in a holistic manner. While in our field, we remain focused on the global learning crisis, which is real and important, there is a global mental health crisis among our young people, and schools will need to play a strong role in addressing those. As I mentioned earlier, parents of children with disabilities have long recognized and advocated schools to be spaces for nurturing belonging, socio-emotional skills, as much as literacy and numeracy. Their voices count. Crucially, children with disabilities also have the right to be counted. The simple yet powerful way of asserting we matter. The second R I'd like to draw your attention to is about resources. This highlights a commitment to working with teachers, training them to focus beyond deterministic ways of thinking about a child's ability, but also developing a wider repertoire of pedagogical skills for the benefit of all children. But it also requires acknowledgement of the realities of these teachers' classroom, and hence seeking ways to develop effective models of support. This requires an obligation to develop innovative models, testing them and learning from these in a contextually situated manner. It is also about extending efforts to promote an inclusive and collaborative workforce. It is about recognizing that teachers play a crucial role, not simply in terms of how they teach, but who they are. An aspect which clearly emerged in our more recent work with secondary school students in Rwanda, with actually colleagues who are here from Laterite and the Rail Center. What we found in engagement with secondary school students, in talking with them about what is their understanding of quality teacher, what did they understand by quality teacher, through again a whole range of exciting participatory methods. What emerged in the students' voices is that teacher disposition was the most important signifier of who they viewed as a good teacher. Was this teacher seen as caring? Was this teacher seen as someone who held good values? Was this teacher well-dressed? Was this teacher having good manners outside school? That was really important for them. Extending beyond human resources, there's an urgent need to focus on basic school infrastructure. 20 years in the field, I never thought I'll be saying this still, but focusing on basic wash facilities and adapted and accessible teaching materials is sometimes put to the sidelines. Small local innovation. Findings from our evaluation of projects under the GEC fund, again, which I've mentioned earlier, showed when designing educational interventions, there's a need to acknowledge that getting the basic facilities right is crucial. These basic facilities have a significant positive impact on all children. There needs to be a commitment from the state that policies are not simply set on paper, but supported through adequate funding. The final R I'll focus on is research, which is very close to my own identity. Leslie Swartz, based at the University of Stellenbosch, has rightly emphasized that, and I quote him here, "It is absolutely outrageous that most of what we know about disability issues across the board comes from the wealthier countries, when by far the majority of disabled people in the world live in low and middle income countries," unquote. Here I go back to where I started my talk. Enhanced visibility of the Southern experience is powerful in disrupting the Northern hegemonic lens. As Aisha Giva asserts, and I quote, "If the South is worth knowing and exploring, voices from the global South should be heard in knowing the South," unquote. When one does look beyond Northern framings, we see ruptures emerge in our current knowledge structures. Here, I'm going to highlight two examples from our research group. This time it's going to be on video. Dr. Kali Christensen and Dr. Seema Nath share insights from their own work. Kali is currently an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, and Seema is an associate director at the Umid Child Center. Sadly, we couldn't beam them in live. Different time difference, but hopefully they'll see recordings. So I'm going to try and see if technology works with me.
Today, I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and stolen lands of the Musqueam people, specifically the University of British Columbia in so-called Canada. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the community-based research I engaged in during my doctoral studies. I explored the conceptions of disability held by Anishinaabe secondary school students with disabilities. This research happened on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples, who are a First Nations or Indigenous group in the subarctic of so-called Canada. My research participants included Indigenous young people with disabilities, their family members, teachers, and local elders. Before proceeding, it's necessary to briefly discuss my positionality. I recognize that education was and continues to be a site of genocide in many places across this globe. I am a disabled, white, and settler scholar who seeks to become more of an ally in the process of decolonizing educational systems. As such, this research was community-based with local elders and the student participants themselves. These Anishinaabe elders and students framed all aspects of the research design, including culturally based data collection tools and appropriate means of dissemination. Most significant among my findings was that conceptions of disability for these students were underpinned by spiritual beliefs. In response to their disabilities, the students explained participating in a range of spiritual practices, and these practices established interconnectedness to their communities, lands, and family members. Due to these spiritual beliefs, disability was not seen as a deficit, but rather a valued identity that was essential to the whole community. This has an impact on schooling and special education practices. Eurocentric or settler understandings of disability largely ignore the role of spirituality. Having school programming that embraces spiritual understandings or conceptions of disability will mean very different things for each cultural group.
Hi, I'm Seema, and today I'm here to speak about my doctoral research. My research explored conceptualizations of inclusion and inclusive education by students and teachers in a set of schools run by an NGO called Muktangan in partnership with the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation in Mumbai, India. It moved beyond focusing solely on issues around access and challenges towards a deeper understanding of how inclusive systems are developed and sustained in schools, especially within the public education system. And thus, the findings help to reframe the prevalent deficit discourse around disability inclusive education. The research closely engaged with students with and without disabilities, teachers, and school leaders to highlight factors that shape the implementation of inclusion and inclusive practices in mainstream schools here in India. The findings reflect that implementation of these practices requires active planning. And most importantly, it highlighted the significance of community building and engagement. The student perspectives also supported this. And students mentioned that they liked coming to school because they felt respected by their teachers. And they felt that they could share their concerns with them and be themselves with the teachers. Teachers and students emphasize how their shared background helped to deepen an understanding of the shared context they came from. The diversity among the students was reflected in the diversity of the teachers. Teachers and students were also forthcoming in sharing that they faced challenges within the school system, but they reflected that they felt a sense of community and togetherness when addressing challenges, and then they drew on their relationships with each other and their peers within the school and with parents and community members outside of the school. Together, it went a long way in nurturing an inclusive school culture. Consequently, the empirical findings helped to map out how sustainability of practices through buy-in from all stakeholder groups is crucial for the development of inclusive schools.
So these are just few of the examples of the kind of research needed in the field of disability. While the focus in my talk has been on examining educational exclusion through a disability lens, I do believe that my reflections and the questions raised resonate with many issues in the wider field of education and international development. As I conclude my talk, I ask, given that power asymmetry lies at the root of many challenges in our field, are we doing enough? Are we doing enough in the spaces we occupy to build a culture of sharing, encouraging shifting of power, and even giving up power when vital for building equity? Inclusive education is not something that is only done out there. It is something which needs to be embedded in our practices. At this conference, as we debate weighty issues of social justice and environmental justice, are we acknowledging enough the complex power asymmetries and are committed enough to disrupting these? We are facing with ever-growing challenges, ongoing and resurgent violent conflicts, climate emergency, which we've talked about, ever-looming presence of new pandemics. We were reminded about the rates of COVID-19 going up. All of these disproportionately impact those who are most marginalized in our societies. Hence, the only way forward is to cultivate more equitable and participatory ways of seeking solutions. I would like to end with a poem of change and hope. I love the fact that Maria ended with hope too. So I'm going to end with a poem it's been written by the late, very celebrated Pakistani poet, Faiz Ahmad Faiz. रोशन कहीं बाहर के इम्कान हुए तो हैं, रोशन कहीं बाहर के इम्कान हुए तो हैं, गुलशन में चाक चांद गरिबां हुए तो हैं, इनमें लहू जला हो हमारा कि जानो दिल, महफिल में कुछ चिराग फिरोज़ां हुए तो हैं. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidhi. That was incredibly powerful, really, really powerful. We got plenty of time, I think, for a few questions and comments that we might get from the floor. So maybe we can take a couple of questions and you can respond. Then we will see how we go and then take further questions. So the floor is open. Okay, there's a hand up here. Yeah, one there, yeah. Please. Yeah.
Nidhi, thank you so much for such an inspirational talk and all the complex facets that you highlighted, the North and the South and so on. And I, at this maybe stage of my life, it's very important to confront bitter truths. And in this entire struggle and the way you have articulated the challenges, the biggest challenge, I think, for the Global South lies within Global South. For all that we face every single day, and thank you for being such a mentor to so many of us in this area and opening the area of disability in our citizen-led surveys, right from 2014 onwards, we realize that our challenges and the invisibility and almost the obscene invisibility of disability in our countries, in our societies, right from our homes to our institutions, to our plannings, to our budget, how do we address that, at that fundamental level? How do we create the spaces that we need to make, the kind of the illumination that has to go within our societies, most of all, which is so punishing. Until we do not address that, I don't know where is the bigger battle? Is the bigger battle at home, in the South? Or is it, like the battles we've been saying, is it the North-South? And I think the bigger battles are the South, and that's what we need to get better equipped at. And it would be great, if from here on a journey begins to be able to address that. I don't know what thoughts you have, but I thought if I didn't say so, I would be very dishonest, because what agonizes us on a daily basis, in our own backyards, is far more painful and profound, and where we may perhaps have not done enough.
Yeah, thank you. So we take another one.
Hi, thank you. I'm Josh.
Maybe would you just quickly introduce
Yes.
who you are and where you're from?
Sorry, I'm Bela,
Yeah.
and I represent Idara Talim Agahi Center for
Thank you.
Education Consciousness in Pakistan.
Thank you.
And the PAL network.
I'm Joshua Muskin from Geneva Global in Pennsylvania, USA. So thank you. It was inspiring and I'm thinking motivating too towards action. I want to share with you our approach to bringing children with disabilities into our schools in Ethiopia and Uganda. We work with out-of-school children, 9 to 14, bringing them in for accelerated education programs. We do not have the resources for training teachers in sign language or in providing abundant Braille materials or things of that nature. We do encourage building of ramps and the like. But we still encourage communities and schools strongly to bring in children with disabilities, even if they can't provide them with these assets. We do when we can. And my feeling is that it's important not just to give these children the opportunity to come into school and learn what they can, but also to give the communities, their teachers, and their classmates not just the understanding that these children have the right to education, but they have the abilities to participate actively in learning and to understand that they, as quote-unquote able children, gain a lot by having them in the classroom with them, learn a lot, and that they themselves have a responsibility for being inclusive. It's not just training the teacher right? So these are some of the ways that we're sort of justifying not bringing Braille and sign language and the like in, and feeling that it's very important that we're doing that. And I'd kind of like to get your sense of, are we on the right path with this? And then also just to ask how you sort of group different sorts of disabilities. We have disabilities that are trauma from conflict. We have disabilities that are severe neurological that we cannot handle in the classrooms or help teachers handle. There are learning disabilities, there are physical motor disabilities, things like that.
Yeah.
So just get some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Nidhi, would you like to respond?
Thank you so much for those questions. I'm on. Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Bela and Joshua. Really appreciate those questions. I'm going to start with Joshua's question first. So, various facets to this. Okay, is that better? The green light is on, so maybe I can hold one. Thank you, Anya.
Would you like to take this one?
I think this is working. Thank you, Balaji. I think this is working. Is that working now? Yeah, I think it is. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I'm going to start with Joshua's question. And there are different things that emerge when you raise that question, which is a really, really powerful one. I think working with low resource contexts, innovation there, engaging what's possible at the community level, etc. is fantastic. It's always a fantastic first step. Work has shown that we did a project called the Teach Project in India and Pakistan. We looked at the learning outcomes of children with disabilities in school and those out of school. And we found that even though there was not significantly high levels of learning for children with disabilities in school, in mainstream schools, but they were definitely higher than those of children with disabilities out of school. Being in school matters. Okay, so that's good. But then the second point is it sufficient to say just being in school is enough? Would we say that for any other child? Just come along, hang around in the school, and that's good enough. And I think that's where one needs to also think about access is the first step. It's not the only step. However much we want to justify it as being an important step, that additional step of thinking about learning for all children, being part of the culture, being part of the community of the school is a really central goal. And I think there is a danger many a times within these debates that we only focus on school enrollment, only number of children with disabilities in school, and we don't look beyond that. So hugely admirable efforts, excellent, I would say, in relation to many other contexts I've heard, but I think we need to be thinking about quality education for all, including children with disabilities, because I think that will also help other marginalized groups in many significant ways. I'm sorry? We do. You do. Excellent. Fantastic. So, disability, definitions of disability, as I started off by saying, it's a very complex construct. Absolutely. When I talk about disability, again, when I was using the UNICEF report, I think it's really important to remember that intersectionality, type of disability, when disabilities was, person got the disability, etc., hugely important factors which don't get talked about. So unpacking that as a construct is really powerful. And that's a question one should be asking pretty regularly about who are we talking about. But my approach to this is also beginning to look at the bigger social construct and how it intersects with other social exclusionary factors, keeping that in mind. So hopefully that answers your question. Bela, that is such a beautiful question. Where is the bigger battle? In the South. I have worked in the field for nearly 2 decades, and I can, from where I stand, having worked in different contexts, supervised students, been in the field within the South is changing. I think we do a lot of disservice to ourselves when we keep assuming that the field is stagnant in relation to how we understand marginalization. Within the area of disability, there is lots happening. What my question to that, is the bigger battle in the South? The bigger battle is always in the context in which you're working. Yeah, it's how you shape it, how you frame it, and how you decide to address it. How do you decide to address it while being true to the context, by being true to the realities of the context you are in? I was very recently at TIS in Mumbai and having discussions with colleagues there. And the point was exactly this: are we spending enough time really understanding our context and how we can respond to the needs of our educational systems? So there are huge issues in relation to the mainstream education system, which everyone's been talking about in the conference, curriculum, learning gaze, etc. Absolutely crucial issues, but what does that mean for the most marginalized groups, and where do they come into that agenda becomes really, really crucial.
Okay. Thank you, Nidhi. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for a very motivating presentation. My name is Bharat. I'm from People in Need, Nepal. And I'm also glad that many of your references were from South Asia, which was really encouraging. And I have a very straightforward question that there might be I don't know if there is a right particular answer, but I was wondering, because there is a lot of debate going on back home, especially around what works best for children with disability, either in a mainstream school, given the inclusion angle and all of that, or the specialized schools, especially if we talk about equity and all of that. So if you have any experience, what works best for children with disability in the Global South, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Wouldn't I make a lot of money if I could answer that question?
Okay, hold on to that. You have to say something to that. Are there any other questions? Oh, yeah, there you go.
First of all, thank you. I also want to say that I really appreciate how you involved your PhD students, and also congratulations to them for their contributions. My question, you started out with your own experiences of attending the program at Cambridge on inclusive education. And so I would like to ask you, now that you are teaching yourself within this program, what are the strategies that you implement to make sure that you don't make the mistake that was made in the past?
Okay, great. Thank you, Lane. Right. Yeah, do you want to respond to those two here?
Okay, so question between special schools and mainstream schools. I don't like binaries. I think that's a very, very deficit-oriented way of thinking about educational systems. Mainstream schools is where all children go. Mainstream schools is what gets financed in countries across the world. Mainstream schools is where children belong. It's how we support teachers in those settings that really matters. Binaries drawn between special and mainstream schools have never worked in any context. Powerful ways and innovative ways of making mainstream schools function for all children, including those with disabilities, is really important. And there's some really powerful examples in the Global South which we should be learning from. So we have the itinerant teacher model, we have the inclusive education resource centers model. They're really interesting, exciting ways of thinking about supporting teachers to make sure that equitable quality education works for children with disabilities. So that would be my very strong leaning. Reflections on the master's program. I would like to hope, and it'll be really good to know from our own students, yes, we have tried to make changes. Firstly, that particular master's program sadly stopped. But now we run a master's program in education, globalization, and international development. And actually, as someone who coordinates that, I think it is something that is very much a part of the teaching team's agenda and consciousness to make sure that the debates we are engaging with, the papers the scholars we are engaging with are from the Global South. And I would hope that's not true just for my university. I know of some really powerful examples of other higher education systems, higher education universities in England, which are doing really powerful work at looking at decolonization of their curriculum. So I'm hoping that the experience I was describing is not an experience that is too common. Though I do realize there are lots of fellow colleagues who work in higher education systems here might have another opinion on it.
Great. So we got a few more minutes. So I just want to maybe throw a couple of questions as the chair, as I can not see hands around, but we can try. Okay, is there a question? Yeah. Okay, so let me ask my question, and then of course you might want to ask after that, because I didn't see your hand out. So when you actually look at this segregated educational provisions, special schools for children with disabilities, and I think there was an interesting question about, like, there are different kinds of disabilities, different kinds of supports needed, and these resource centers need a lot of resources because, you know, there are different kinds of needs that they should be able to support. And when we've done some research around that, particularly in Nepal, and there was a question from Nepal, these resource centers are in really, really poor conditions, and teachers are not trained for the last probably decade, and they're the lowest paid support workers in these resource centers, and there's a very strong sort of cultural dimension, unfortunately, that not everybody can learn at the same level. That's the kind of a very deeply rooted cultural mindset among the educational workers, as we found. So as a result, it's okay for a child with disability not to learn. If they're doing just, you know, bare minimum, that is good. So we shouldn't be expecting them to do as well as other children. So I think there's that kind of feeling. I don't know what to do about that. I think that Bell's question also alludes to that kind of thing. My second question is about intersectionality, right? So I think there are children with disability who come from more privileged backgrounds, higher castes maybe in South Asia, or parents who can actually put more resources to their education. Their educational experiences are likely to be better than the children who come from low caste, marginalized ethnic groups, or girls in remote geographical areas. So how do we tackle this intersectional dimensions of disability and the varied experiences? Okay, so shall I take one more question and then you respond, ensemble? Yeah.
Hi, Nide. Thank you so much for such an inspirational keynote. Honestly, it just blew me away. So my name is Suad Abdullahi. I'm originally from Somalia and grew up in the UK, but went back to Somalia 5 years ago to take inclusive education, school of thought back, thinking that I had something amazing to take back. But when I went back and realized the lack mindset that you have mentioned, and everybody was pushing back to say that it's not possible, it can't happen. And my colleague from Pakistan kind of alluded, the problem is the global south. But one of the things that I really wanted to ask you is that the discourse of inclusive education has started from the global north. And we have had that discourse in our mind, but reconstruct that in the global south face challenge because of the lack of research or data that has been amplified. And to find out that you have done a lot of work in this field in the global south, particularly on that part, but in Africa, a lot of the work that comes out is through the INGO's lens or the donor lens, which sometimes is not kind of a homegrown research that are coming out from the local universities. So how can we generate a grassroots knowledge from the locality to kind of change the lens, or as I call it, decolonization of inclusive education? What route can we take in order to get there? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for those very powerful questions. So I'm going to start with Tejendra, your question. what you're describing is the problem with the model or the lack of systemic issue there. The fact that teachers are not trained, the fact that they are not well-resourced resource centers, isn't that a political will and a state issue? How can we blame the fact that it's a model or an educational arrangement which is not working? And that's the danger which I find, that we've put in place lots of different other innovative models of support, such as the inclusive education resource centers or resource centers in different schools, etc., and we expect them to work without the right resourcing, without the right training for teachers, etc. So I think the problem is not the model, the problem is not what one is trying to do, the problem is that it's not taken seriously enough. There isn't enough political will or financing attached to these. As someone who has looked at educational policies in India, especially in relation to children with disabilities, the proclamations made in educational policy was about what should be there for children with disabilities. If you were actually going to make that in reality happen, it would require like a 300% increase in the government educational budget. Okay, so there's a big disjuncture. And I think that is what needs to be called out rather than saying it's not possible. The other thing which I think is important to underscore is how we see it as a systemic issue or not. We say teachers should collaborate with resource centers. Do our teacher training programs encourage teachers to think about collaboration? We train teachers to be one single adult in a classroom with the doors closed around them, around four walls or under a tree, whatever. This is the notion of a single adult, and we expect them to collaborate. So that's another disjunction in how the system approaches. The issue around the issues we are talking about, how educational access differs for different socioeconomic groups, is so powerful, and I'm thinking the same debates apply to education of the poor. Right? So if you're from a different socioeconomic background, the quality of education that you receive in different mainstream systems is already very truncated compared to a child from a richer family. And again, there are colleagues here who've done enough data analysis to show that patterns operate. There's a lovely paper by someone called Poonam Batra at the University of Delhi, and she talks about capability deprivation. And she talks about how poverty, how the poor child is the one who gets neglected in the classroom, how they experience schooling differently from other children, even though they are in the same class. And when I was reading her paper, I could literally superimpose poverty for disability, and the paper would still make sense. And I think that is to some extent, my plea here, that it is not about something additional and extra all the time, but when we are thinking about quality, equitable education, we have to keep children with disabilities in the center, because then we begin to think about simple ways of making adjustments, changes in our mainstream education systems, which could move from simple things like writing in a bigger font size in the classroom to something much more important. So getting that right, getting disability into mainstream debate where it's not just an afterthought, where it's literally not something you think about in the end, is really important. We talk about girls, we talk about education of the girl child. What about the disabled girl child? How often do we think about that? And this intersectionality is what I think I'm appealing to in many ways. I am always worried when we position the global south in a very deficit-driven approach. Yes, there are challenges. No system has understood how to deliver equitable quality education for all children. In the UK, I don't know how many of you would be aware of this, but the recent stats show that the special schools are rising. Okay, there's been an increase in the number of special schools. No system has understood it. Why do we put down our own systems? Why do we focus only on the deficit aspect of our systems? There are things that are working. There are enablers in these systems which we need to think of. Because, you know, if we keep pointing out the problems with our system, 10 other people will stand around me and tell me what's wrong with my system. My approach is start looking for what's working. Start looking for what's working within your context and use that as a starting point rather than focusing on what is not working.
Right. So that's really, really fascinating. So we're coming to almost the end of the talk, and I would like to actually give you a couple of minutes to say any nice things you have to say about anything you would like.
Okay, thank you you so much, Devendra. I do. It would be amiss if I didn't end my final remarks on a note of gratitude. Sorry. Thank you, Kamila. It would be amiss of me not to end this talk on a note of gratitude. It has been a very difficult year for me, and I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of people were centrally involved in me being here today. And if I could encourage you to get on to the next slide, then Chandra, please, can you just use the clicker? Up, one back. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to my research group. You've seen a few of them here. I would not be able to name all of them. Huge, huge gratitude to all of you. We talk about ableism, disability, but we don't talk about ableism and academia and how disabling it can be. And thank you so much for everyone here, for those on the slide, for being absolutely fantastic co-collaborators in my scholarship and in this delivery. And I also want to say thank you to Professor Yusuf Saeed, who is joining us online, and to Professor Madeline Arnott and Professor Anna Robinson-Pant, who are very central in the keynote and hearing some of the initial ramblings around it. And of course, a big gratitude to all of you for engaging. And thank you, Tejendra.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that everyone here is desperate for disco tonight. And I hope that the rest of the conference that you enjoy and the ideas discussed here at the keynote continue to inspire us and engage more creatively and proactively. Thank you. Have a lovely evening.